Holy Blessed One, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Occasionally through the Gospels, we see Jesus referred to as Rabbi. One of my rabbi friends straightened me out about that. About 100 years after Jesus died was the beginning of the rabbinic era, the beginning of the Jerusalem and Babylonian Talmud being codified and being brought into a disciplined, codified structure of learning. So before that time, in Jesus' time, the title rabbi simply meant teacher. What Jesus was he was a Moshe Moshelim, a wisdom teacher. This was understood as a role in society in his time. He was a wielder of parable. The people in his time and place understood this. Of course, he was drawing crowds bigger than most wisdom teachers, and he was making himself a nuisance to local authorities. But what is important is that his teachings and his teaching methods were unusually effective and unusually powerful. This is especially true in his use of parables. These were his favorite go-to device as a narrative teaching tool. A parable is really an extended metaphor in story form. A parable is memorable, but is not factually true. Its function is to invite listeners into the world of the story, and from there they can see something beyond the limits of the story. A parable will have those who have heard it thinking about it for quite a while afterward. If Jesus just was telling a fable, wintertime was coming and the smart ants put all their food in a box, there's not much to think about there. But with a parable, there's layers and layers that get peeled away over time. And parables are always fictional. They don't report something that actually happened. But like a myth, a parable is always profoundly true. We've heard these parables so often in Western society that they've become part of our canon. They've worked their way into our day-to-day language. Oh, he's the salt of the earth. That person is like the prodigal son. He went away to L.A. and came back. Someone was a Good Samaritan. He stopped and helped me change my tire. They've lost a lot of their original clout. Jesus' parables were always shocking. They were meant to be shocking, and they were meant to be startling for his audiences to hear. And he very intentionally used hyperbole and exaggeration and even sarcasm, out-and-out shock factors, to get the attention of his listeners. Because just like us, sometimes they needed a 2x4 to the forehead to get their attention, because they're wrapped up and preoccupied with all their ego stuff, just like us. And so Jesus, in dialogue with the scribe in today's reading, does what he does best. He uses a parable to illustrate an answer that he has yet to give. The scribe is a lawyer, not the way we think of a litigator in court, but an expert in Mosaic law, and the laws of Moses in their most essential and literal interpretation. And in essence, this person is the same as the Pharisees, who were understanders of the law from their very literal perspective. And as always, Jesus is not content to let people live with their narrow, legalistic, literalist interpretation of Torah. His contention and his constant, blunt, clear, and public message was, you may live out the letter of the law, but you don't go far enough. It has to be taken into your heart and lived out as a human, as one human to another. This is why he had a problem with these people. Now, the text says that the scribe put a question to Jesus as a test. And this may indicate a level of disrespect, because you're not supposed to challenge a teacher. But it's interesting to see that in his question, he talks about earning his way into worthiness in God's eyes. What must I do to inherit eternal life? Now, Jesus could very easily, at this point, have taken the tack of discussing salvation issues, but instead he uses good Socratic methodology and answers the question with a question. What is written in the law? How do you interpret the law? So Jesus has turned everything around by posing a question in response to a question. He's now in the position of evaluating the scribe's answer, as opposed to having the scribe evaluate his answer. And so we see Jesus as a master teacher, adroitly directing the conversation and the teaching where he wants it to go, where it needs to go, to a discussion about love and behavior, not mere interpretation of law. So the scribe answers Jesus' question by quoting Deuteronomy and Leviticus, and of course Jesus tells him, well, your answer is correct. You've given an orthodox, scripturally proper answer, but to teach that kind of love requires more than orthodoxy. It requires orthopraxis. In other words he has to go and use, but then he has to practice what he preaches. So the scribe, knowing that there are people that he simply cannot love, asks, who is my neighbor? Now, love your neighbor as yourself is from Leviticus. It's a core tenet of Judaism. Therefore, it's a core tenet of our belief. And it's one of the pillars of the Torah. The scribe is hoping against hope that Jesus will give him an answer that will justify what he already believes and practices. It says that. To justify himself, he asks, okay. We're the same way. We want to be told that what we're doing is great. Just keep it up. There's no need to leave your comfort zone. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's all good. So now that Jesus has gotten the scribe to ask the question that he knew he would, Jesus launches into his parable, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Now, we're pretty sure that we know what a Good Samaritan is. I mean, we have Good Samaritan hospitals, right? And we refer to someone who helps us out of the blue as a Good Samaritan. Well, remember when I said that the parables were always shocking for Jesus' original audience? So let's take this one apart for a minute and see why this would be shocking. In the story, a man is traveling from Jericho to Jerusalem, and he gets mugged, in essence. Now, that 17-mile journey from Jerusalem to Jericho has always been, and in some ways on foot, still is, a fairly dangerous passage. There's a lot of hidden caves along the roads. There's outcroppings of rock, perfect for bandits and robbers and muggers. The Roman Jewish historian Josephus notes how people often protected themselves and were armed as they traveled this road. This is a famous road. Think urban alleyway at night, okay? So our victim is lying on the road, left for dead, and a priest comes by. Now, that's not shocking. There's a center well, that's actually now a rabbinic center, but there is a center for Jewish study there, and there are priests that walk that road sometimes during the daytime. So the audience is thinking, oh, a priest is coming by, surely help is at hand. But the priest not only doesn't stop, he crosses the road to get as far away from the victim as possible. A great teaching tool again, this narrative device on Jesus' part of injecting distance into an action. Then a Levite comes by, a member of the tribe that has been designated as assistants in the temple. He must have a degree of compassion. He'll stop and help. But no, he too crosses the road and hurries along. Jesus is setting up his audience, right? Devout Jews all, because then he says, but a Samaritan while traveling came by, and when he saw him, he was moved with pity. Now, hold on for a minute. A Samaritan? It would be like one of us telling this story and saying, first a minister came by and crossed the road and kept going, and then a moderator of council came by and kept going, but then a drug-dealing neo-Nazi biker with face tattoos stopped and had pity on the man. His listeners are saying, a Samaritan? I'm not exaggerating. Jesus already did the exaggeration. The Jews hated Samaria and the Samaritans for hundreds of years, and it's completely mutual, by the way. They weren't just outcasts, they were the despised enemy. So Jesus is really taking advantage of a shock factor. The hero of the story is a bad guy. And now Jesus really drills down. He uses the same amount of language that he used to describe the actions of the two Jewish leaders to detail what the Samaritan does to save the man. He comes up to him. He heals him and anoints him and dresses his wounds. He puts him up on his mule. He takes him to the nearest inn, and he pays the innkeeper to take care of him until his return. Having laid out this potentially devastating narrative, Jesus asks the obvious question: which of these three do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? What color was George Washington's white horse? I mean, this is the most obvious question that you could ask. And of course the lawyer knows the answer, but as in the parable of the prodigal son, where the older son won't even use the word brother to refer to his brother, instead saying to his father, your son, the scribe won't use the descriptive Samaritan. He says, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus ignores that and says, you've given the right answer. Go and do likewise. As human beings, we have a primitive need to define ourselves by and against other people, us and them, this and that. Our Vietnamese teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, says, "I'm like this, you're like that, what nonsense." And Hindu wisdom debunks this kind of duality with the expression neti neti, which means not this, not that. There's no this and that. There's unitive reality. This need to be different is our ego, that limiting, solely human aspect of our nature that Jesus calls and commands us to transcend in everything he teaches. Jesus commands us to remember that every person is a child of God, is loved by God, is exactly equal in the eyes of God. We have our own little meritocracy because we're small-minded and petty. But God's love is unconditional. God's love is abundant. For us, we behave as if our neighbors are the people who agree with us, the people who look like us, the people that like the same team we like, as I said to the kids, who live where we live, who belong to our denomination, who vote as we vote, whatever designation or definition we've come up with. We're wrong. If you're 3 states away from where we live and you pull into a 7-Eleven at night and behind the counter there's someone from another country trying to work his way through, that's your neighbor. If you get into a shouting match with someone over politics or some other little human issue, that's your neighbor. If you think about the person who you dislike, the one who you think of in the least compassionate terms, the one who really pushes your buttons and makes you crazy and who you think has no right to stand there and be so wrong, that person is the apple of God's eye. This isn't easy. It's profoundly counterintuitive. Our reptilian brain tells us, you're different, you're special, you're set apart. Look out for them. It's a survival thing that we have to overcome. We don't know how to think of people that way. I remember working with a number of other churches doing inner street ministry down in Newark. We were working with the hardcore indigent, the people who lived in the tunnels and bathrooms and garages around Penn Station. And there were 6 different churches involved. And one of the church's members, a Montclair church, not this church, they brought some of those folks up to their church on Sunday for worship. The people in the pews were not happy. They weren't very comfortable with these unwashed, mentally unstable, socially graceless people being in their midst. And the people who brought them hadn't thought twice about it. They didn't think, oh my God, that's not a good idea. Let's face it, it's easy to love the people that we find lovable. The people that agree with us, who make us feel good, who don't make us uncomfortable. And it's hard to think of those that we've designated as others, as our neighbors, as worthy of all of our love and compassion and all the concern and care and of God's love, as worthy as we are. What does tribalism do? It creates tension because it's born in dualistic thinking, and that's the source of most of our problems. The great philanthropist, humanitarian, intellectual Jimmy Carter, who apparently at one time also was a public servant, once said that when we take the good news of the gospel into our hearts, we want to go out and share that with the world. So we go out and share it with people who have yet to hear it. And what he says is, by defining those who have yet to hear the good news, we've designated an other, and that's the potential for all discrimination, oppression, and persecution. So we've been called as followers of the Christ to greatly expand our vision of who our neighbor is. And we need to be told to do this because our brain will only allow in those who we can defend against the outside world, and we put up walls and barriers. We need to be taught to move beyond that place, and it begins with what we teach our children. Our teacher, Richard Rohr, points out to us that we took the amazing transformative path that Jesus brought to us and we turned it into a mere religion, a religion of belonging instead of a way of transforming our lives as children of God. We created a system where you have to earn your way in and somehow get granted membership in our exclusive club by using certain words and saying certain phrases. I'm a saved believer, so-and-so is a sinner, whatever. And we do this because we have a need to feel special. We have a need to feel set apart and to be better than. And so our neighbor becomes the person that is as acceptable as we are, as accepted as we are, as worthy as we are worthy. Meanwhile, in reality, every human being is completely worthy of all the love there is. And that's what our children need to hear, and that's what brings me to Mr. Rogers. This is something that Fred Rogers understood, Mr. Rogers, Reverend Fred Rogers. He understood that neighbors are the people that surround us in any given moment, the people that are with us in that moment, not just in our little sanctuary. And he went so far as to create a theme that asked, "Won't you be my neighbor?" I mean, how lucky am I to be able to preach a sermon? There's a movie in the movie theater right now called "Won't You Be?" That never happens, you know. But "Won't you be my neighbor" is not "let me be your neighbor, let me come from where I am to you," but "please come into my sanctuary. Please come into my safe space. Cross all those boundaries of the defensive and be with me because you are loved." What an amazing lesson to teach people. What an amazing and beautiful lesson to teach children, that they're respected, they're honored, they're treated as equal, treated the way we want to be treated, especially at a time when we're kicking toddlers into cages. And yes, I said we. Fred understood and promoted and could not see anything but the inherent dignity in each human life, the value and worth of each human being, of every single child. His teaching was, and still is, so powerful, so potent, so true, that when certain small-minded, close-hearted, fear-mongering, hate-filled people, the kind that always need to blame someone, came to criticize him, all they could say was he was making children feel special, and therefore they were being made into creatures that were entitled. Now they're entitled because you told them they were special. As if we should tell a 3-year-old, "Hey kid, you need to pull your weight around here. You're not valued until you contribute." Really? What a horrible, mercenary, empire-based view of humanity. Jesus taught the exact opposite, that you are loved and valuable because you are part and parcel of God's good creation. And that's why Jesus always began specifically and directly with the disenfranchised, the marginalized. You'll notice he didn't hang out with Roman senators or powerful members of the Roman army. He went in the exact opposite direction, to the bottom of society, because he wanted us, as his followers, to see and understand and get in our bones the fact that the marginalized, the least of these, are God in our midst. Mother Teresa famously called the poor of Calcutta Jesus in his distressing disguise. This is truly radical, radical from the original Greek meaning at the root. The radical understanding of Jesus' radical, inclusive, and unconditional, loving acceptance of all people. And it's exactly what we don't want to do. We may say with our lips, "I love everyone. Everyone deserves love." But we live in the thick of a meritocracy. And that's why it's hard and so very important to think in terms of becoming downwardly mobile, to start shedding all the excesses of what we have in our lives. It's very telling that there's an entire successful business model of renting storage units to people who have 3-story houses, basements, and garages, right? I can't hold all my stuff. I have to put more stuff over here. We're bloated. So here's the bottom line. If your system of governance in society includes hungry children, your system is broken. End of story. And if that's the case, then those of us who come to church on Sunday, who raise our hands and say, "Yes, I follow the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth," we have work to do. When Jesus said, "Pick up your cross and follow me," he didn't mean put a little cross lapel pin on your jacket, you know. He grew up at a time when crucified criminals and political prisoners lined the main roads. He knew exactly what he was getting into, and he knew exactly what he was calling us to do. Pick up your cross and follow me, this rough-hewn, splintery burden. He wasn't saying, "Follow me into a comfortable little safety zone." Because Jesus, following him, actually following him, not merely praising and worshiping him, which is cheap grace. Following Jesus is hard, uncomfortable, and inconvenient work. And it's exactly what Fred Rogers was doing, going completely against the grain of the culture and of the empire. Because our culture is built on the survival of the fittest, the first. As long as I come out on top, it doesn't matter what happens to you, and that's sickness. It's why so many people are depressed and anxious and unhappy, because we're taught everything except how to love one another. In writing about Fred Rogers, David Brooks, one of the New York Times token conservative columnists, wrote, quote, "And here is the radicalism that infused his show, that the child is closer to God than the adult, that the sick are closer than the healthy, that the poor are closer than the rich and the marginalized closer than the celebrated. In the gospel of Fred Rogers, children are our superiors in the way they trust each person they meet, the way they lack guile, the way a child can admit simple vulnerability. Children are superior for their instinctive small acts of neighborliness, the sharing of a toy, a small hug. Rogers was drawing on a long moral tradition that the last shall be first." I'm still quoting him. It wasn't just Donald Trump who reversed that morality, although he does represent a cartoonish version of the idea that winners are better than losers, the successful are better than the weak. That morality got reversed long before Trump came on the scene by an achievement-oriented success culture, by a culture that swings too far from humble and earnest caritas. Fred knew that we received God's grace without condition through other people, through our neighbors. He called us gently but firmly out of our power structures and our silos of sameness. Fred's legacy endures because, as Brooks wrote, moral elevation gains strength when it is scarce. May we learn to ask everyone we encounter to please be our neighbor, and to do so with open-hearted willingness, with compassion, love, and with grace. May it be so. Amen.